Segment, we're going to be talking about training delivery, and there are really three main kinds of approaches: the traditional ones, the technology-based ones, and then the employee development-based approaches. So let us jump in with the traditional approaches. So the most traditional of all the traditional approaches is the lecture. Even when you're being trained for work, you get the pleasure of sitting through lectures where those of us who are farther along in the process, tell other people what they should be doing and knowing and how to behave. They are economical. They tend to be the quickest way to get information from one person's head into another person's head. But the effectiveness really varies based on what kind of content you're teaching. It's really helpful for facts and knowledge. It's why we use it so often in college, right? Because we're conveying facts and knowledge. It's not as useful for developing problem-solving skills, definitely not as useful for developing interpersonal skills. A lot of times lectures don't include any kind of practice, any opportunity for overlearning, any opportunity for feedback. So it doesn't necessarily contain all of the components of what we see as really valuable in training. So a lot of times people combine lecture with something else. So for example, on-the-job training. This is probably across all different fields and all different kinds of industries and stuff like that. This is probably the most widely used. The main assumption is that you can learn the new job by watching an experienced employee perform the job. Asking questions of that employee, talking with that employee. That employee might even do a little bit of lecturing you as the new employee. This is what we normally do. And they might give you a little dissertation on the job. You do have the advantage of working with the actual job materials, which is a huge boost. The downsides are that we rely really heavily on that other employee to be the trainer, right? And so you better have a good trainer. That employee better be a good role model and good example. And a lot of times companies will use this strategy instead of having a carefully planned training program. And so you can get very, idiosyncratic training where one employee gets a terrific set of training from even the same trainer, because the one employee asked great questions, maybe had good facial expressions that caused the trainer to realize that they were confused or something, whereas another employee might have gotten an entirely different experience from that trainer. So on-the-job training, maybe in combination with something like lecture, would make a little bit more sense, or maybe in combination with some self-directed techniques. This is where we ask you to, use self-instructional materials, read them yourself. You've got this going on right now where you've got a textbook. Usually the materials are based on learning principles so that they sort of work you through the steps. One of the things I liked about the textbook that you guys are using is it has those application questions and critical thinking questions. And I really like the taking it to the fields example. So it kind of gives you that sort of on-the-job training enmeshed in the self-directed materials. It's really most effective when the learner is motivated. I know college students aren't necessarily super excited to read their textbooks on average. And that is not me saying that about you. I'm saying when I was a college student, I didn't really read my books either. I went to class every day. And I oftentimes, I would go buy those books and never open them. I had to buy my books with my own little waitressing salary and everything. And I oftentimes never read them. You've got to be motivated for this kind of self-directed learning to occur. And that's tricky. And then there's virtual reality training. And that is, really some kind of simulator that's as realistic as possible. I've got this person wearing VR headset and everything. It's not necessarily that, realistic. But the idea is to try and make it as realistic as possible so that trainees are more likely to transfer the skills that they acquire. It's oftentimes used for those kinds of jobs that would be too dangerous, costly, or inefficient to actually train you on the job. Because can you imagine if we just sort of put airline pilots in a plane and let them figure it out? That probably wouldn't be a very good idea. So we use it for those kinds of jobs. Absolutely. And then it also can really bolster other jobs. I mean, these days, most surgeons do some virtual reality surgeries before they ever even do cadaver surgeries, things like that. Factors that help to determine the effectiveness of virtual reality training. One is, what we call physical fidelity, how much it actually mimics the real world. Back in the olden days of virtual reality, it didn't look like the real world very much at all. There's a really good example on Scientific American Frontiers where they were using virtual reality to help people get over phobias. And they tried to develop these environments where a person might, let's say, encounter a spider. And the environment was very, I'm trying to give an example of, I don't know, it's almost like Minecraft quality graphics going on. It's hard to imagine that you would really transfer very well your experience in that virtual reality situation to an actual real life situation, right? Where there are all sorts of places for a spider to be hiding and all sorts of other things. So physical fidelity is a really important factor. And then psychological fidelity, right? That the behavior needed for success on the job are also the behaviors that are necessary for success in the simulation. So if in the real world, you actually would reach out and grab the object, but in the virtual reality world, you have to push F, that's not very similar, right? The behaviors aren't very similar. And so the transfer, I got used to pushing F and now I'm supposed to reach out and grab it. What is this? So it needs to be as similar as possible. And of course, today's virtual reality is nothing like what I was just describing with the spider world. So, virtual reality, for one thing, has become less expensive and has also become a lot better. And so it can be applied in a lot more job fields than it used to be. Now, speaking of technology, there are technology-based approaches. Like, look at this old-fashioned one. I love this picture because it's got a 5 1/4 inch floppy and a CD-ROM. I was looking at, I've got my work computer here at home with me, and I've also got my personal computer here, and I'm like, neither one of them have a CD-ROM drive anymore. They used to be like just a given on a laptop, and neither one of them have them. So these materials I'm showing are a little antiquated, but the audio visual is where we have some kind of multimedia presentation. These can be just as effective as live lectures. The nice thing about having them be in some kind of recorded format, whether it's streaming on YouTube or it's on CD-ROMs or whatever, you can stop it. You can go back and listen. I notice sometimes I swallow my words and I hear other people swallowing their words. So that last, like the very critical term that you were going to define, you actually said it under your breath. And so being able to pause, go back. One of the things I'd add to this audio visual is that sometimes they have closed captioning so that, it actually will have the word typed out for you so that you don't have that problem. You can pause it and take notes. So those are really good options and characteristics of the audio visual. They tend to be a little bit more interesting than having to do one of the just straight lecture or some of the other techniques I'm going to talk about. And so the typical trainee ends up more satisfied with their training experience. Distance learning, I wonder what that might be. Oh, what you're experiencing right now. Where we have different locations at the same time. And, like I said before, I opted not to do like the full Zoom where we were all meeting synchronously. But that would be what we mean by distance learning. If we were having a Zoom meeting, I could deliver the lecture one time. So it's very efficient for me. And then your job is to listen, take notes, pay attention, right? So you're really responsible for how you're internalizing and what strategies you use to internalize it. It's a lot less expensive. In the olden days, a big company that, let's say, has multiple locations around the country would fly all of their employees who were new to the one training place. And they'd all show up at the same time and go through their training together with the one instructor. Imagine the cost savings where we could say, okay, we're going to have the one instructor in the room and maybe the local people who are right in this area can come in and experience it live. But everybody else who's at a distance, you guys watch it on your computer, right? Like that's a huge cost saving for a company. E-learning is where the entire thing is delivered through the internet. The entire thing is self-paced. It's what I've been referring to as asynchronous, because the materials are there and you interact with them at the time that you can. The benefits, it's really a lot easier with the internet to go in and change material than it is to go re-record an entire lecture or something, or to have to give the lecture entirely over again. It's really convenient for both the trainer and the trainee, right? Because I can log in and respond to you guys when it's my convenient time to do it. You guys can log in and submit what you need to when it's your time to be doing it. So it's super convenient. And then, as you know, we can have discussion groups and other kinds of things that happen in e-learning. So you don't have to be isolated. I'd like to introduce also the argument against the discussion groups and other things being helpful, which is that a lot of times they have to happen in writing. And so that can be a real stumbling block for a lot of us who would, we could have a much more, we would say much richer things if we could just say them than we're willing to type out with our fingers. And then also people are willing to listen to us say things more than they're willing to read what we wrote. And so I think more information is probably communicated if you can have actual voices involved than if you have to actually read and create it in typing. That's my perception. I've been running discussion boards for 20 years. And I've noticed that a lot of times there are misunderstandings, in part because the writer tried to be brief so that they didn't have to write too much, or so that they wouldn't overwhelm their reader. And then their reader misinterpreted this briefer version that maybe had it been longer, they would have gotten the point. It's tricky. It can be slightly more effective than classroom-based training. One of the things that if our measure of competence is performing well on a quiz or something like that, people oftentimes will do better on a quiz that's delivered online than they will do sitting down and pulling it out of their memories. So it really kind of depends on, the learner's own motivation. A lot of the times, I think we can all agree to that, right? Working at a distance is really difficult because it feels like, for one thing, well, I guess I could just do it tomorrow. Whereas when you have an assigned class time, you can't just do it tomorrow. Class was right now, right? If there's an exam going on in class on Thursday, you have to be in class on Thursday or you miss the test. As opposed to e-learning, you're like, well, I could always take it later. My son-in-law is training to become an electrician. And so he mostly works as an electrician apprentice. And then he has like 1 weekend a month where he's supposed to take classes. And so thanks to COVID, he can't meet in person. And so he has had for the past month this set of materials he was supposed to have engaged with, processed, and then ultimately taken a quiz. I'm not sure exactly what else he was supposed to do. All I know is that he had done none of it and it was due last night. And so of course he didn't even begin it until like 9 p.m. the night it was due. And that's really not really great for him remembering what it was that he was supposed to be processing, right? Like that's one of the downsides of e-learning. As long as you beat the deadline, it's fine. Even if you beat the deadline by doing it really, really quickly. And so you didn't really have that opportunity for overlearning and all the other stuff we've talked about. The combination of distance learning and e-learning is really the dominant training method right now in the US. We are really moving to this idea that people shouldn't necessarily be flying around or driving around to get to trainings. And, for at least, I'd say for at least 10 years, employers have been moving towards trying to have less expensive training. And so this really suits their needs. We can also, it really improve the connectivity and stuff that people feel if we add in an in-person component. And if we do that, that's called blended learning. And at Eastern, we have a school psychology master's program. And there's what we call a blended learning program. And then we have an all online program. And the blended learning program, the only in-person component is that they have to come to campus 1 day per quarter. That's it. But there's a lot of feeling a commitment and things that come from that in-person component where you get to physically meet your professors and you get to physically be on campus and just have that connection that, if you're online, you may not be experiencing. So that little blended learning, that little added in component can be really helpful. So that blended learning can take different forms. Like in this one, we're asking the students all to come to campus one day per quarter. The flip can happen where maybe let's say, like I said, we have that organization that has, satellites all over the country, and we have new recruits at each of the satellites. Maybe the most efficient thing to do would be to send a trainer to each of the satellites one day a quarter or once during the training or something like that. So we could have that hands-on kind of human approach combined with the distance learning strategies and the e-learning strategies. So, all right. Now, there are employee development-based approaches that I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is where we're trying to help employees to grow and develop. So, orientation is one of those situations where maybe you have all the skills, knowledge, and others. I skipped one: skills, knowledge, abilities, and other things. Maybe you have all the things that we need, but we want you to get oriented to our culture. Maybe we want you to socialize with the other employees so you'll start to form that team building and stuff like that. So employee orientation and new employee socialization trainings are really about helping them to acquire the culture of the organization. Coaching is oftentimes used for managers, and this is where we have people above the managers advising and helping them to develop their goals for improving performance. And a lot of times coaches are kind of, you might have heard like mentor used as a phrase, but coaches are a little bit more, I'm trying to think of the word that is not cheerleading. They're a little more encouraging. They're there to provide guidance. They're there to facilitate the skills acquisition that the manager needs. They're there to serve as an inspiration for the manager. So coaches are multi-level and lots of different roles that they play. It's more than just maybe a mentor who, a lot of times a mentor is somebody who's farther along in the career that you're in, and you turn to them for having your questions answered or something like that. Here, a coach is a lot more hands-on, much more I'm here for you kind of approach. Executive coaching has become a very big thing lately, and that's a coach who really specifically works with executives and helps them to develop skills that will help them to be a better executive. So, leadership, organizational skills, things like that are particularly needed by executives. So it had used to be the case that coaches were usually for managers, but now executives are looking to have people who will be in their corner to help them to become their best selves. Behavioral modeling is another employee development-based approach, which is where we're acknowledging that most social behavior is learned through modeling, right? Modeling is that term that we use for when a person behaves in a certain way and then we behave that same way because we saw them do it and we think that's probably the appropriate behavior. So behavior modeling is, maybe pairing you up on purpose, but sometimes you're behavior modeling incidentally, like you do it every day when you're trying to figure out like what is the current style of dress, or what are other people carrying their books to class in, or where is a good place to eat, and you see people going into a place to eat or something. We look to other people all the time for ideas about how we should be acting. And so sometimes it just happens incidentally like that, where we're looking around at our peers. And sometimes through that kind of behavior modeling, we can draw incorrect interpretations. I'll give you a non-work example. How many times have you been driving and everybody else is going above the speed limit, so you come to the conclusion that it must be okay because everybody else is doing it? Right? That's behavior modeling. The truth is the objective law is always the objective law. It doesn't matter how many people are going too fast. But we look at what everybody else is doing and we think, well, this behavior is okay. I remember when I briefly lived in Florida, and I was driving from Tampa, Florida, which is sort of the middle of the west coast of Florida, up to Pensacola, which is up in the panhandle there at the top. And so it took me all day, and I had no air conditioning in my car. It was quite the delight. But anyway, so I'm driving up there, and all of a sudden it just starts thunder and lightning and just a downpour of rain, and I'm not from Florida. So every time these kinds of thunderstorms would happen, I'd think, oh no, it's a hurricane. I didn't know. So I was kind of freaking out and driving in this just torrential rain. And one of the things that reassured me was that, well, everybody else is still driving. Like nobody else is pulling over. Like this is scary, which is funny because how do I know that all those people aren't also people who aren't from Florida, right? But I was using their behavior as a model for what was okay, like as if they know something I don't know. And so a lot of times we'll look at other people's behavior and we'll base our behavior on theirs. I did it kind of consciously. I literally looked around and I said, well, everybody else seems to think it's all right. I literally just kept driving. I was trying to figure out, like, if I pull off the road, how do I make sure I'm not under a tree? I'm so confused. So I just kept going and I ultimately drove out the other side. And spoiler alert, I lived, everything was fine. But it's a good example of how we oftentimes look around at other people. And so sometimes we'll do it to the advantage of the company, where perhaps we're looking around and we're figuring out what the appropriate behaviors are through seeing what everybody else is doing. And everybody else is in fact modeling good behaviors. But sometimes we actually pick up bad habits by watching our coworkers who maybe are cutting corners or are doing things that the company would rather them not do if the company knew that they were doing them. So it's kind of a double-edged sword to rely on behavior modeling as a way to, develop good employees. Business simulations. I found out about this one in more detail when my daughter was a business student, because in her program, they got to do these kinds of exercises where they were given a brief introduction of a company's background. It's usually a fictitious one, but she did Tyson chicken. So I don't know if it was fictitious Tyson chicken. I don't know. Anyway, so the introduction to the company's background, the situation, the organizational problems, the organizational goals, and then they're asked to make decisions about it. And a lot of times this is done in teamwork kinds of situations. Usually you're given a team. In my daughter's example, she was the marketing major. And so they grouped them in, I think there was an accounting major, a finance major, a marketing major in each of the groups. I think there was a fourth person. I don't recall. So that you have maybe different perspectives for how to solve the problem, things like that. So you could imagine that you could have these kinds of simulations in lots of different kinds of scenarios where you could have teams go through and try and solve the problem. And then the organization can kind of look at the ways that people are reasoning through the problems and, how they're arriving at their solutions, and maybe use the best strategies, maybe try and, encourage people toward better strategies, things like that. And then some corporations actually have their own universities, they call them. I don't think it's considered, just FYI, it's called a college if the highest level degree that's conferred is a bachelor's. It's called a university if the highest level degree is at least a master's. So I'm pretty sure McDonald's does not confer master's degrees, but we all get what they mean by hamburger U. Anyway, there are lots of companies that have some variation on these kinds of very specific training scenarios where they're actually trying to train managers a lot of times, but they might be trying to train their mid-range employees, the ones who aren't just doing entry level but are ready to go to the next level, things like that. And they really want to invest their energy in employees with good potential who are showing good commitment to the corporation. A lot of times that kind of, employee commitment makes the company want to, reciprocate. And they say, this looks like somebody who will probably stay with us for a long time. And with the proper skills, they could really be a good manager or executive or something. So we'll train them up in our culture specific with our skills specifically and like that. Okay. So how about evaluating the learning that has occurred in training? Well, we have two routes. We'll start with Kirkpatrick's taxonomy. Kirkpatrick says that we should look at the R, which is reaction criteria, and that's the trainee's attitudinal reactions. So how did the trainee react to the training as far as what effect did it have on their attitude? Are they more pro the company, less pro the company? Are they more are they feeling more self-efficacious about their ability to achieve the goals of the company now that they've had the training? Are they feeling more committed to the company as a result of the training. So reaction criteria, L is for the learning criteria. How much did they actually learn? And we might have to assess this through something objective like a quiz or something like that. Behavioral criteria, how much has their behavior on the job actually changed after experiencing training? Results criteria, oh no, another R. And this is the ultimate value to the company. Are we getting the outcomes that we want as a result of the training? The correlations among these items range between 0.6 and 0.63. So this is among these. So the correlation between the reaction and the learning criteria have a correlation between 0.6 and 0.63, between learning and behavioral. But see what I'm saying? And so like these things all seem to relate to each other. So a person who has, let's say, a positive attitudinal change tends to be a person who learned a lot, and who also tends to be a person who shows differences in their behavior on the job, and whose training seems to have ultimately provided value to the company. So there's these relationships among these components. That's important to know because the augmented framework suggests that maybe we don't need all of these things. First off, it lumps the reactions together. So we've got the affective reactions and the utility reactions, the usefulness lumped together. So how much has my emotions, my attitude changed? Affective means emotions. So how much of my attitudes changed now that I've gone through training, and how useful did I think that training really was? The learning part, they have expanded out to have 3 types of learning. Immediate knowledge, which, like I said, might be assessed through a quiz or something like that, and seems like really what Kirkpatrick was focusing on was sort of that immediate knowledge. But then in the augmented framework, there's also knowledge retention. So maybe we're going to come back later and administer that quiz again or something like that. And then there's also behavior or skill demonstration. So is the person actually able to translate what they learned in training to actual behaviors or demonstrations of their skills? And then with their B, they're referring again to the behavioral criteria, and what they're looking for, it's really those on-the-job trainings, but they're using that transfer criteria. Are they actually showing transfer of training so that they seem to be understanding that what they learn in training needs to be applied on the job? These are not well correlated with each other. And so that sounds negative, right? That sounds like that's not a good thing. But a lot of times what we would like in a framework or a taxonomy is to have independent factors that we're measuring. The fact that Kirkpatrick's taxonomy is all intercorrelated means that they're all sort of kind of maybe tapping into the same thing. Whereas in the augmented framework, it's possible that we're actually with these three levels, we're actually tapping into different aspects of the training experience. So it's possible that the augmented framework might suit, an organization's needs more than the Kirkpatrick taxonomy would. All right. So how do we evaluate? So quasi-experiments are probably the most viable alternatives for evaluation of training programs. When we have quasi-experiments, what that means is that we are not going to have random assignment of participants to groups. That's the big problem. So there's a couple of different ways that we can go about a quasi-experiment. There's the pre-test, post-test design, a really common strategy, oftentimes in intro to psych classes when we're trying to determine whether we've actually taught students anything. We give them a test at the beginning of the class to find out what they already know about psychology. And then we give them a test after the class to find out whether they now know more, right? Changes would reflect that we have actually taught them something, right? And same thing with training. So if we give a test at the beginning and everybody is already performing perfectly well, and then we give them the training, and afterwards we give them the test again and they are still performing perfectly well, there's no change. Well, I'd say that training was superfluous. We did not need to waste our time doing that. On the other hand, if we have people who are performing really well at the pre-test, we give them some training and now they're performing worse. Oh no, we're having negative transfer of training. They're actually worse after the training. So ideally, we only administer trainings where people perform more poorly at the pre-test than they do on the post-test after the training. Hopefully, training improves their performance. So here we have the pre-test. happening first. We give some kind of training, and then we give them a post-test. And our goal is that the post-test score is going to be higher than the pre-test score. Now, the pre-post design with control group is the same exact thing, but now we are in fact going to have a random assignment of some people to experience the training and some people not to experience the training. So let me reveal that. So we've got the experimental group who are going to go through the training. We've got the control group who's not going to go through the training. So here's what we need to see in this kind of design. We want to see that the experimental group and the control group score the same on the pre-test. Hopefully these are all people who are, not already knowing what we're going to be training. And the groups are fundamentally the same before training occurs. So they should end up with the same score pre-test, right? Same pre-test score. Then we give the training to the experimental group, and then we administer a post-test score, a post-test. And we want to see that those post-test scores are different between the experimental and the control group, right? So there are two things we want to see different. We want to see that the experimental group scores higher on the post-test than they themselves did on the pre-test. And we want to see that the experimental group scores higher on the post-test than the control group scores on the post-test. Now, the function of the control group is to make sure that, first off, that the groups started out the same. That implies that the pre-test score is solid. And then we want to make sure that the post-test scores are different, implying that maybe it wasn't something that just happened out in the environment, that everybody all got this knowledge independent of training. Like maybe it was out in maybe there's a Netflix special about it or something. Everybody happened to watch it anyway, and our training didn't matter. We want to be able to eliminate that interpretation. And so a control group helps us to establish that really it is the training that changed the behavior on the post-test. That's the goal. So you can tell I'm stuck at home. We're all watching the same Netflix show. The Solomon four-group design is the most costly strategy to implement, but it gives us the strongest confidence that the training is the important factor. So here's what we do in a Solomon four-group design. So we have, I'll start with the rows. So pre-test, question mark. So yes, that would be the group of people who are going to get the pre-test. No would be the group of people who don't take the pre-test. Now you might be wondering, why would you want some people not to take the pre-test? Well, some people worry that if we administer a pre-test, that it might somehow, be sort of like training and cause a change on the post-test, right? Like the fact that I took a pre-test somehow primes me or alters my performance on the post-test. So you have some people who take the pre-test and some people who don't in the Solomon four-group design. Then we have the training columns. Some people got the training and some people didn't. So in that upper left quadrant, you have the people who took the pre-test and took the training. On that same row, one to the right, we'd have the people who took the pre-test and didn't get the training. Go down a row, you have the people who didn't take the pre-test and did do the training. And then in that right-hand quadrant, we have the people who didn't take the pre-test and didn't do the training. Okay, so now we're going to want to see some groups scoring higher and some groups staying the same, right, on their post-test. So we would like to see, for example, the people who took the pre-test, so yes, pre-test, and yes, training, scoring differently from the people who took the pre-test and didn't get the training. So we would hope to see a higher score in the yes square than we see in the yes-no square. And then with the pre-test yes, we'd like to see with the pre-test no. So the next row down, people who didn't take the pre-test but did do the training, we would like to see them scoring the same as the people who did take the pre-test and didn't take the training and did take the training. Oh, this is confusing. I don't know if you can see my mouse if I point. Let's see. Oh, I think you can. So we want to see these two groups, the yes training, regardless of whether they took the pre-test or not, we want to see them scoring the same on the post-test. We want to see the people who took the pre-test and did the training scoring differently from those who took the pre-test and didn't take the training. We'd like to see the people who took training score higher than the people who didn't take the training, so that we can eliminate the interpretation that the pretest is the reason why they're scoring differently. If the people who took the pretest score the same whether they took the training or not, then we can make the argument that the pretest is the reason why they're scoring differently than they had before. Right? So we're eliminating lots of interpretations here. So if we say both of these groups score the same, then training is the key. If these two score differently, then training is the key, right? It's not due to the pretest. And then if we have people who have not taken the pretest and have not taken the training, we would expect them to perform lower than the people who have taken the training in either case. It's kind of confusing. And the reason why it's more expensive is that you literally have to have 4 separate groups of people, some who take training, some who don't, some who take the pretest, some who don't. Everybody takes the post-test, right? So it's a little bit more time consuming, but it allows us to determine whether our training is really the key factor, if that's really what matters. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. That's a good place to stop because we're going to come back and we'll finish this chapter with our last section.